Thank you. Senator Perdue, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Senator Cardin for staying on this. We've been distracted by the Iran nuclear debate and dialogue over the last few months, obviously, but it's only a factor. It's a part of a bigger issue. And I want to thank Senator Menendez for the last few years, even before I became a part of this conversation, of trying to shed light and put pressure on this administration, members of his own party, to try to develop a long-term strategy. Mr. Katolis, I couldn't agree more that I think in recent months our top priority has been the nuclear Iran deal for whatever reason, at the expense of developing a long-term strategy not only for ISIS, but our policies in the entire region. I personally have been very measured about this. I'm glad to see us moving back to a nonpartisan position on this, because this is war. We have men and women at risk every day in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other parts of the world. We need a strategy, not only for them, but for this humanitarian crisis. Mr. Bauer, God bless you for what you guys are doing. With limited time, I want to focus on the cause of that. I hope another day we'll have another chance to come back and deal with the possible solutions to this crisis, because it's out of control. But I agree, Mr. Katilis, this is a pivotal moment. I'm just a business guy, but if you look at what our history has had over the last 50 years, we are in a more dangerous period right now than any time in my lifetime, in my estimate. Rise of traditional rivals, Russia and China. I was with Admiral Harris just a couple weeks ago, where he informed us that we are now at military parity in the Pacific region, the United States and China. That's a very dangerous place to be. In the Middle East, General Campbell in Afghanistan will tell us that, hey, this is about developing a long-term strategy in that area, and yet we still don't have one. I've never seen a more confused battle space than Syria. In southern Syria, four groups are battling right now, and in any given week, in any given village, any combination of those four could be fighting against the other combination of those four. So given that, I want to talk about, and by the way, in the backdrop of an environment where we are now told that even the data upon which we're all basing our decisions, including the administration, may be in doubt. We have 50 analysts just this week or last week complain. We had 2 analysts now filed a letter or sent a letter to the Department of Defense saying their reports are being doctored as it goes upstream to support the administration's strategy. And then we hear that Foreign Minister Lavrov in Russia has basically said, let's make sure that that the United States understands that there will be unintended consequences if our militaries don't cooperate. Cooperate in Syria? Really? And yet at the time when we're engaging Russia in a dialogue, Senator Ashcroft, Secretary of Defense, is not even in the meeting. So I'm very concerned about our strategy there. I have a question. Given the fact that we're now facing with, it looks like this Iran nuclear deal is going to be put in effect tomorrow, I guess, and given the fact that Russia now is on the ground with troops and military equipment inside Syria, let's start with you, Dr. Kagan. I'd like you and Mr. Katilis to address, though, how do those two developments, we talked around it today, but specifically, how should that frame and how does it complicate, and how should that frame our thinking about advising and consenting on helping the administration develop a strategy for that part of the world to avoid the future catastrophes of at a human scale that we see today?
The United States would benefit from having a strategy that is as consistent as the strategy that the Iranians are pursuing and that the Russians are pursuing. I think we are, in fact, over-compartmentalizing what we see transpiring in the world around us, and we have a tendency to want to fight ISIS, but not take on a counter-Assad fight, when in fact that's what the majority of Syrians are fighting for. We have a tendency to think that what is happening in Ukraine stays in Ukraine, and that what happens inside of Iraq is one part of a theater that can be segregated from what happens inside of Syria, when in fact we have enemies such as the Islamic State, shifting resources from one to the other. And when we have a set of catastrophic failures in the governments of two neighboring countries. So my strongest recommendation is that we recognize that our interests in Iraq and Syria are real, that they extend beyond the fight against the Islamic State, that ought to have consequences for our policy and ought to allow us to broaden the range of what we provide on the military or diplomatic side or economic side in order to stabilize two crises that are really spilling over, not only into the region, but into the world.
Mr. Senator, I think this broader strategic perspective is very important to raise, and I think it's my view that the U.S. strategy in the Middle East has been AWOL for more than a decade. I would argue that if you, and I put this in the written testimony, but if you look at what the conception was in the post-Cold War period, particularly in the Gulf, it was this notion of dual containment. We were going to contain both Iran and Iraq, and I would submit that that largely succeeded. You know, and one strategic consequence of the 2003 Iraq War and its aftermath was this upending of the regional order, that we helped inadvertently to facilitate the rise of Iranian power in the region and its connections to various proxies.
Could I interrupt? I'm sorry.
Sure.
And specifically in that, could you address the Sunni-Shia balance and the fact that today it looks like those lines are being drawn in a way that we haven't seen before? I mean, they've always been there, but I mean, right now, if you look at what Saudi and Iran are doing, you see two pivotal points being placed there. And what happened in Yemen earlier this year, it affects what you're saying. Could you address that as well?
Right. I mean, it's, the truth of the matter is that's true as an analytical framework and as a dynamic, but it's very complex. That was happening, I would submit, even while the United States had 170,000 troops in the center of Iraq. A lot of the massive displacements and sectarian cleansing that happened in Baghdad, even at the height or right before we did the surge in 2007, a lot of that, I think, was, I wouldn't say it was inevitable, but it was sort of a rebalancing, and it's an ugly process that is happening quite clearly throughout Syria. But back to the broader point is that I think, and I'm not blaming either administration, I just think the United States, essentially since 2004 or 5, has been in the Middle East in a largely reactive, tactical crisis management mode. We're not driving events. The exception to it, again, and I'm in favor of the Iran nuclear deal, but I think we need to be clear-eyed about its role in the region, and I agree with a lot of the comments that were made here. And one of the main points I was trying to stress in my opening statement and in my written statement is that what I don't see at this point post-Iran deal, if it sustains itself, is an integrated approach that looks at all of the tools that the U.S. already has in play in the anti-ISIL coalition, the patchwork of different bilateral cooperation efforts we have with partners in the region, and how does that sync up with what is now being proposed in addition to all of that in light of the Iran deal as reassurance to our allies. It'd be great to get a clearer presentation of that because, and I think that opens the pathway potentially to what a strategy for U.S. engagement here, one that recognizes that there are actors in the region, many of which have nefarious purposes, some of whom are actually our partners, but then work with different forces that are contributing to the fragmentation of Syria or Yemen. Mm-hmm. So trying to figure out a new strategic framework of how do we actually get to a broader goal of sustainable security in the broader Middle East. I think it's the bigger picture in which these different theaters, Iraq, Syria, I'd add Libya, Yemen to that. We don't have that overarching picture right now, and I think it's in part, with all due respect to the Obama administration, it's lean to disinclination and caution in reaction to what were viewed as, I think, dangerous mistakes of commission in the previous decade.
Well, and add to that, if I may, the Pashtun and the other people that are not, you know, they're without countries, you know, so the Kurds, the Pashtuns, I mean, that's a dimension we haven't even gotten to yet in terms of complicating this sectarian issue in the region. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.